This week, we speak with Doug DePerry from Datadog. In the news segment, Bluetooth Low Energy fuels some CVEs. The OWASP SAM matures to version 2, a deep dive on trusted execution environments, a sinking feeling for TLS, and more. Stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. It's the show to learn the latest tools, techniques, and processes necessary to understand DevOps, application security, and cloud security. Your trusted source for the latest application security news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. With 84% of cyber attacks targeting the application layer, securing your software is more challenging than ever. Synopsys enables DevSecOps with a portfolio of industry-leading tools including Coverity, Black Duck, and Seeker to help you build secure, high-quality software faster. Synopsys is the leader in application security testing. Visit securityweekly.com/synopsys to learn more. Nearly every business today relies on mobile applications, yet the vast majority do not adequately secure them. Once downloaded, mobile apps escape your control outside the secure network perimeter, thus making them easy targets for hackers. Enter GuardSquare. From the makers of ProGuard, GuardSquare integrates transparently and seamlessly into the development process, adding multiple layers of protection to Android and iOS applications, and effectively hardening apps against both on-device and off-device attacks. Request a demo today of GuardSquare at securityweekly.com/GuardSquare. The question is simple. Have any of the systems on my network been compromised? The answer is harder than it should be. Enter AI Hunter. Active Countermeasures has automated and streamlined techniques used by the best pen testers and threat hunters in the industry to create AI Hunter, a network threat hunting solution that does the first pass of a hunt for you to identify systems that are most likely to be compromised and scores the results on a scale from 0 to 100. You can then research those systems in depth with AI Hunter. Focus your valuable time on the systems that need your expertise with AI Hunter. Sign up for a personal demo today at securityweekly.com/ACM.
Welcome to Application Security Weekly. This is episode 96, recorded February 17th, 2020. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Matt Alderman. Hey, Matt.
Happy Monday. Thanks for holding down the fort last week. You guys had way more fun than I did.
Well, we'll make up for it and have some fun today. Don't worry, Matt, because we've also got John Kinsella here. Hey, John.
Hey, guys. I'm here for all the fun.
Well, glad you're here for all the fun. And if you're also here to join us at InfoSec World 2020 from March 30 through April 1st at the Disney Contemporary Resort. Security Weekly listeners save 15% off the InfoSec World Main Conference or World Pass. Visit securityweekly.com/ISW2020. Click the register button to register with our discount code or the schedule button to sponsor a micro interview. Attend RSA Conference 2020, February 24th through 28th in San Francisco, California. Visit securityweekly.com/RSAC2020 to sponsor an interview with us on site at the conference or register using our code to save $150. Doug DePerry has held multiple positions in his 3 years at Datadog, including Director of Product Security and currently Director of Defense. Prior to his current position, Doug led the Bug Bounty program at Yahoo. Much of his 12-plus years of experience in the security industry is on the offensive side, as a security researcher and consultant at Leaf SR and iSec Partners, and helping establish the Yahoo Red Team. Prior to that, he worked for various defense contractors and the U.S. Army. Doug has presented at multiple security industry conferences, including Blackhat, DefCon, and multiple OWASP and DevSecCon events. Hey, Doug, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Mike, how's it going?
It's going quite well, and we just so everyone knows, we actually cross paths a little bit too at Yahoo, and I think we can maybe even talk a little bit about lessons learned in the past, because what you are going to be doing next week, I think, is coming out to San Francisco for B-Sides, and you're part of a panel talking about lessons learned from the DevSecOps trenches. So let's pull you out of that trench for a bit.
Sure.
And what's something that you've learned that maybe you'd like to start us off with?
Yeah, sure. I've learned a lot of things, not only just at Datadog, but just generally from being in the industry for so long. It's actually kind of strange when you think about 12 plus years of working and working in the same industry, and I've seen a lot of things come and go. A few things that I've learned. relatively recently is things like focus on the basics. And there's a lot to unpack there, but basics is one thing that you'll kind of always hear me preaching about. The other thing is about how it wasn't as clear to me, when I first joined Datadog, how much the people really are a large part of the the general problem of security. And I don't like to use the word people problem, per se, but there's a lot to learn about working with human beings as opposed to just computers.
No, that's interesting. I think there's one of the things people like to learn from is always the mistakes of others. And so since you're the guest, we'll focus on perhaps your mistakes rather than all of mine, which maybe take a little bit longer. But you mentioned like working with people, and you did also say, I think if we talk about one of the basics of working with people to also kind of tie the two things together, the security industry over the 12 plus years, I think, has come around from avoiding the idea that it's actually a people problem and people are the problem, and figuring out what does it actually mean to work with developers who are building complex systems or systems at scale. And I think you were kind of alluding to that. So I was kind of curious to unpack that a little bit. And when you're working with people, working with dev teams, what were some of the things that either surprised you about that or gave you a new and better understanding of ways to approach application security?
Yeah, sure. So, like I said, I think soft skills are huge here, right? And so it's not necessarily I think that a lot of us that get into security or like just technology in general are just not necessarily prepared for the social skills aspect of things, right? Like words like compromise and negotiation and like getting people to do things that they probably don't want to do can be pretty important.
You mean starting with no doesn't go over very well as a starting point?
No, believe it or not, yeah, people don't like being told no. It's strange. It was I had to be in my mid-30s before I was able to understand. I'm kidding, but like that sort of thing. It's like I said, I walked into the job and I knew that intrinsically, right? But having that, demonstrated, time and again is much different, and trying to learn from that is much different. So, like I know one thing for, that's usually not a great recipe for, getting the job done is like anything that negatively affects a developer or a software engineer's workflow. Anything that slows them down, makes them do too many steps to, too many new steps to do a thing that they used to do in 3 steps and now takes them 7. That's not going to really endear yourself or your team to those folks.
Well, because that's interesting, because there's this idea of like agile we're supposed to be shifting left and putting more responsibility on developers, right? So how do we balance that out and start telling them, hey, you all need to start doing so much more, and it's going to take all of these more clicks to do so?
Yep. And that's hard, right? I think along the way from and if I can digress slightly to going from a more waterfall sort of thing to a more agile approach, more modern like security practices or security practices that are trying to keep up or trying to enable development shops that are working with agile methodology. Like what happens is you used to be able to kind of, and I'm generalizing of course, but you'd write the code, you kind of throw it over to the fence to QA, who might throw it over to ops or security if you had a security team, and so on down the line. And now with more modern development practices, you are going right to prod from your laptop, which is great for a large number of reasons. Don't get me wrong, but just because you are skipping these longer and drawn out steps of QA, of security, of ops, doesn't mean you can ignore them, right? And so you still have to do this same work, but you have to do it in, if you want to keep that speed, you've got to do it in an automated fashion. And so like automating and creating constant feedback loops between security and engineers, as opposed to, engineering teams and the customer, is kind of, I think, where you can get some wins.
But I also think that's where security folks and vendors still struggle a little bit, right? We think that we've got these great tools, and if we just give them logins to these great tools, that the developers will use them. And I've been this believer for a long time that if we're not integrating our security solutions and those different checks along the way, right, whether it's a static analysis or software composition or dynamic testing or whatever it is, I need to integrate those tools and the results of those tools back into the developer tools to make it really, really easy, because otherwise they see that as an impediment, not as an enabler.
Exactly. Yeah, I think you're exactly right. And so, this concept of modern security approaches or methodologies is all about, kind of keeping up with that and kind of doing security in a much different way than we're used to. And I almost don't like saying it in that way, but it's true, at least in my recent experience. But this is all stuff that guys like Zane Lackey and Rich Smith were talking about years and years ago, when they kind of like helped push this general idea into the forefront as their companies were kind of going through this DevOps revolution, so to speak. So, do things, automate as much as you can, move fast as much as you can, stay out of the way, iterate, use the same tools that your developers are using. These are the sorts of things that we like to focus on.
So I was curious to go back a little bit too when you're talking about the building foundations or focusing on the basics of security, and you're coming at this too with a good background in the offensive security. But I'm going to make a guess here that just because an organization is being targeted by an APT doesn't mean they need to suddenly change their threat model if that organization also isn't patching their known vulnerabilities in their software. Is that a pretty good guess, or are you going to put your red team hat on and rip everything apart with using 0 days and advanced techniques?
No, I mean, I'm going to do whatever's easier, right? Like that's like anyone else at any job ever. You know what I mean? That these more advanced threats are, they're working kind of normal jobs too, except their job is to break into stuff, right? And so I think if you are not at the point where, and of course it depends on your company, depends on your industry. A Bitcoin startup has a slightly different threat model than a SaaS provider, right? So like you have to kind of, again, threat model, understand what you're protecting, and be able to understand that doing sorts of like basics like patching, vuln management, dependency security. Those are the things that are going to get you first, because you can automate exploits to that, and you are one accidental exposure of a particular host or messed up firewall rule from getting owned before you even know it.
Yeah, just scan for an open S3 bucket, rip all the data out, and you're good to go.
Yeah, exactly. You know what I mean? Like, and it's like you gotta play for these unforced errors, right? Like, and then, in my opinion, and then you can kind of like worry about being able to handle the things that you may not necessarily be able to control, but if you can kind of like reduce the blast radius of things that you can't exactly control, I mean, they're going to blow up eventually. It's just how big is the boom?
Yeah, I think one of the big challenges I see in not only the DevOps movement, but when you combine that with the cloud movement, is that configuration management isn't very sexy, and we tend to forget about it. But it can create all kinds of havoc under the covers. So besides my basic vulnerability discovery, I think there's a lot of great tools out there that do that in the CI/CD pipeline. I think there's effective ways to do patching. The one area I haven't seen a lot of innovation around yet, at least on the pre-deployment side, is configuration. I think there's some interesting runtime tools out there. But if I can move configuration validation, some configuration management earlier in the pipeline, I can also avoid some of these really costly errors when it comes to misconfiguration in the production environment. Kind of how do you approach that today? What can we expect to see in that space? Because I think that's a really interesting area that hasn't evolved as much yet.
Yeah, I agree, and I've been. And I think there are some tools out there now. I don't remember off the top of my head, but when I kind of first started at Datadog and we were looking into these sorts of things, and I'm trying to understand what are basics, and we had what are the basics for Datadog, and what can we utilize to just do our job better. And to your point, the kind of more obvious one is static analysis and CI based tools, that sort of stuff. But the configuration management side, there wasn't much out there, at least at the time. And sure, I'd love to be able to do more stuff with like a static analysis of Terraform configs, for instance, right? And I just think there's, as I think you get more and more infrastructure as code sorts of just like that general idea, and as that spreads and more folks are doing it, I think it's a really good opportunity to do kind of very similar things that we've been doing for your typical coding language with your infrastructure as code type of stuff in your configuration management.
Yeah, it's just one of those interesting evolving areas that I see a couple startups coming in that space, but I haven't seen much in normal production yet, and I think that's a big opportunity to close some holes.
Yep, totally agree. Mike, you were about to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say there's also, talking about scanning, analyzing the infrastructure, but also perhaps on a smaller scale, but at a larger scale in terms of complexity, there's also containers and container security. And I'm kind of curious, I know your background, you've also been exposed to some really large environments. And I'm kind of curious, when you work with developers or work on security in those larger environments, what becomes a different lesson, or what becomes something that was actually used to be pretty easy to say, like, oh, we'll just be patched, or we'll just use a golden image for this particular container, suddenly becomes particularly hard? And why are some of those reasons, do you think?
Yeah, and it comes back to, you're absolutely right. It comes back to kind of the scale thing and the basics, right? So like the basics aren't necessarily basic at any reasonable scale. The first time that kind of really hit me in the face was at Yahoo, right? And you're talking many thousands and thousands of hosts that, tools just don't exist to manage those very easily, right? And so we had a bunch of things together in a number of different times. And while Datadog, is not nearly as old as Yahoo was, and so there's a lot more. They've been able to take advantage of a lot more like modern methodologies, modern tooling, that sort of thing. If you're still talking about many thousands of hosts, it's still not easy just to hit the patch button. And so it's I think another one of the just not even talking about number of hosts in general, but just number of dev teams, number of products. Again, going back to Yahoo, the large number of products and verticals and whatever was mind-boggling. At Datadog, that's been a lot more something that's much easier to kind of like wrap your head around or get your hands around. But there's still a lot of different dev teams, right? There's a lot of different code being written, a lot of different types of code that you have to deal with, and so as you kind of spread out and grow and as things kind of get fractured, it just becomes really difficult to keep up, because the solution that you come up with to address doing static analysis or doing some basic regex based type of static analysis on your Python code, obviously that's not going to work on your Golang code or your Ruby or your Scala or whatever the case may be. And so coming up with kind of like a single solution for a single thing can be difficult enough, but as depending on how diverse your environment is, it can be a real challenge.
And what's interesting too, you also mentioned, because I was actually had been thinking of the complexity and scale of just the technology side, but you brought up a really good point about just so many different dev teams to interact with. Is there some type of strategy you've started to adopt, or some way you've changed your approach in the way that you try to engage with developers, or especially within a whole bunch of different teams?
Yeah, and that was one of the more difficult. And I'm not going to say we're far from solved that, but we did find ways in which to like do that a little bit better. And so one of the first things that I had wanted to concentrate on, again, like I read up a lot of this stuff. I read a lot of books, talked to a lot of people, and the one of the big focuses was, you got to focus on your developers. They have to be, you have to be friendly with them, and then they'll tell you what to do, or they'll tell you what they're working on, and they'll tell you what they need help with, and then you can, kind of work together with them to get the job done. And that's fine if if all of your dev teams have, or, you have 3 dev teams and they all do a daily stand-up, and you can go sit in with them and listen and make a comment or whatever. But if you're talking, dozens of dev teams across multiple time zones, multiple continents, that becomes obviously more, just the communication aspect becomes more difficult. Never mind just, hopping into their stand-up. And so, one of the things that we did was we looked into, how automation could help us there. And so, we created this tool, and it, kind of started out as a proof of concept, and then we continued to build on it. But, basically it was kind of like a internal open source intelligence gathering, right? Where we called it DevSecOps, because we had someone who was kind of like, carrying the pager, so to speak, on a daily and then a weekly basis. And essentially this we wrote a number of scripts that would go through our various systems that we had. We were using Trello at the time. We had some stuff on Slack, GitHub, and we had to go and looking for code changes to files that had to do with authentication, authorization. We had to going through certain Trello boards looking for new projects being started and that sort of thing. And so we kind of like just consolidated all that information into one area, and then whoever, like I said, whoever's job it was that day would kind of just keep an eye on the scroll and just take a look and say like, oh, hey, look, that team's doing this team's doing that. We should, keep an eye on that going forward, or, hand this off to so-and-so because that's your area of security. And we were able to get like a pretty good pulse on the organization, from that method.
That's pretty cool, because it sounds like you managed to embrace that chaos of what people are working on and interacting with people, but you had to do it, it sounds like, with some homegrown tools, yes. Which, again, smart way, automate what can be done. I'm curious, do you have some other tools in your tool chest, your Batman tool belt, that are either open source or commercial, types of tools that you do like to go to help address some of the basics in your environment?
Yeah, sure. We use a number of different things, and I mean, again, this is probably even a longer conversation as well, but the whole build versus buy argument is, I think it's a calculation you need to make, prior to every kind of like major decision as you're trying to solve, different aspects of security. And so, and depending on your team, depending on your company, depending on your culture, your budget, like all of these things kind of factor into this. But I think it's a really important thing to take seriously and really think about. So things that we use SNCC for dependency scanning. That, again, we had built some automation around. I think the thing, if there's a trend there, at least when I'm involved with an organization, is that we do the build versus buy thing, but very rarely would I ever just like buy a thing and use it straight out of the box and be like, all right, we're done here, we're good. Products aren't made like that, right? Like they'll maybe do their best to make it one size fits all, but there's always a certain amount of like tweaking and changes and improvements that you can make using some basic scripting or maybe it's a larger development effort. But if you've got the tools, if you've got the people, you can get it done. And I find that it's almost always worth the additional investment in time as well as money to kind of like get things done in that manner. So like I said, we use SNCC for dependency scanning. Recently, we using a product from Castle.io to help guard against account takeover attempts. Again, that's not something I'm going to build. And then another commercial tool. So we use Signal Sciences WAF, of course, because that's another thing I'm not going to build. And with an approach like that, they understand modern security. I'm trying to implement modern security, and so it really fits right in with not only kind of like my general philosophy around security in general, but like Datadog itself, modern DevOps culture and improving visibility and that sort of thing. So it's look, that's like a handful of tools we use. I can think of off the top of my head. Static analysis, a little bit mixed bag for us. We have some commercial tools from Checkmarx that we use. We also have a pretty good amount of custom things as well. And I think that combination again gets you regulatory and compliance checkbox, as well as the other side of the coin of focusing purely on things that are, again, for us, Datadog specific, bad patterns and things of that nature.
Hey, Doug. Hopefully my network connection here can stay up long enough for me to ask you a question.
Sure.
So around what you're just saying there, what might be interesting to talk about is what have you done from an aspect, or do you have stories that you can think of around, so you're just talking about build versus buy, but how about you started off building something, or like as you started using something more and more as the company started growing, you realized that, oh, we shouldn't be building this, we should be buy. Have you ever run into anything like that where it's sort of you went down one path and then realized, oh, this is actually more painful than we thought?
Not really that I can think of off the top of my head, although it may kind of just like pop in my brain 5 minutes from now when we're talking about something else. But I find that happens pretty often to me. But I would say one of the things that was, looking back, one of the things that was frustrating when, maybe this will answer the question. When I first started Datadog and I showed up and I was the third or fourth security hire, hired as director of product security. But when I came on, the security team was very young, very new. And as I kind of like tried better to understand the lay of the land, and I was interviewing team leads and talking to developers and PMs and SRE and everyone. And, it became clear to me that the focus should be more on our infrastructure security. And, I talked over the CISO at the time, and he completely agreed. And so that's what I, started off doing. And that wasn't really, in my wheelhouse of things to do, but, worked with the team to do our best and create a modern logging and alerting platform that would work for us. And we wrote a blog post about this a while back on the Datadog engineering blog. But one of the frustrating things for us was, we didn't think that there would be after some research that a commercial tool would fit us well. And so as we, of course we didn't build our own log shipper, right? But, the gluing all the different parts together was something that we kind of had to do on our own. And one of the frustrating things when you're building things in the cloud like that is you'll get to, you do planning out, but then you'll get to a juncture where you're blocked for whatever reason. And, maybe perhaps like this new service doesn't have the ability to communicate cross account. And we need to manage multiple accounts. And so, you put the brakes on, go back to the whiteboard, figure out a way around it to get what you need, and then you move forward. And then it turns out like a month later, the public cloud company releases, this new feature where you can now do the thing cross account that you couldn't do last month. And so that would happen to us multiple times. And it was just very frustrating where, it's not, you're not necessarily talking build versus buy, but you're talking like the amount of, the speed of the iteration of public clouds as well as companies is, kind of a difficult thing to manage sometimes.
Yeah, definitely.
I'm curious too, because you mentioned, for example, even in build versus buy, tools like just doing software composition analysis, so third-party dependency scanning. There's still some aspects that you can't build or buy your way out of, I think. And this goes into you have to make time investments, which was something you mentioned earlier too. Because and I'm curious too if you've learned something here, if you have some wisdom or just some mistakes to avoid that you can impart on us. But what happens when you're doing third-party dependency analysis? The dependency has a vuln. The dependency is needed for the app, so you can't just rip it out. Yet the dependency is now an orphan project from the the open source community, so there's no patch to download. So how have you then I guess you could possibly build or buy your way out of that, but given that type of scenario, how do you respond to that?
Yeah, and that's a difficult situation, Mike. Thank you for bringing that up. No, it's a rare occurrence, and again, this is not something that we've solved, and it's a rare occurrence, but it is one of those edge cases that is something that can very easily happen. And I think at that point you can't necessarily automate your way out of that, right? When you're talking about known vulnerabilities in specific package versions, like doing your best to mitigate those in some way is kind of like the lower end of the bar, right? Like if you can at least do that, you're in a good spot. You're not going to be completely, it's not 100% security, but that's fine. 80% is better than zero. And so when you get to that point, you don't necessarily know if you are using that dependency in a vulnerable way, if you're even using the function where the vulnerability exists, and so there, to the best of my knowledge, there's no good automated way of figuring that out. And so at that point, it is it's going to be a manual process, and that's going to be a little bit resource intensive. And so you kind of need to make sure that your mitigations or your plan for mitigating this issue is kind of a tiered effort, right? Like what's the easiest thing we can do is just stop using that dependency. If it turns out that we can't upgrade or update, or is there any other way that we can mitigate this particular problem by using if we do know where the vulnerability is, if we can use the dependency in a slightly different way, or use a slightly different library function to do this thing. And as you kind of like work on down the line, you're getting slightly more effort, more resources involved, until finally it's like at the bottom of the line, it is, I really need this dependency. There's nothing else that will do this thing that I need it to do. Writing it ourselves is not an option, and so I need you, security team, to tell me whether or not we are actually vulnerable to this and help us figure out a way around it. And I think at that point, it's a manual effort for between a couple days or maybe a week for at least one person, and you try to minimize that as best you can. But I think at some point, that's how the cookie crumbles.
Yeah, I mean, Paul has a lot of experience with this. I mean, we've been going through a lot of this dependency stuff in our own app, right? And, Paul's done a really good job of trying to mitigate the number of vulnerabilities, but I need the curl library to finish the build. So he's moved to multi-stage builds where he uses curl, knowing there's vulnerabilities in it, to get the dependencies he needs to get the container built. Then he goes to a second build stage to rip those pieces out to try to eliminate the vulnerabilities. But it's taken him weeks to figure this out. This is not something that you can automate. You really have to understand the details of all those different pieces to be able to do it that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is patching, right? But that it's, as you just explained, it's not easy to do. And even when you automate the whole thing, it takes you a long time to get to that state, and then work with it, maintain it, going on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, and one of the things you were pointing out there near the end there too, Doug, was that it's great if you have the automation story around third-party patching, third-party dependency scanning. They can be updated, roll the PR, go for it. But if you can't, which was that nice friendly scenario I threw your way, but you pointed out that if it's not exploitable, or if it's not exercising, it's not in a code path that's being exercised, that's actually a good thing to have confidence in. You don't want to just assume that's the case. But that's a good way to approach this from a threat modeling or a risk management perspective, to say, here's a couple of controls. We know that for now we're not going to be vulnerable to it, but I'm going to guess you could also just say, here, we're now going to tag this bit of code, and in that open source intelligence tool, if I get the word out, that you were describing internally, that's just one of those great things to say, here is our custom alerting monitoring for this area that we know is brittle, and for now we're pretty confident that it's not too bad, but we don't want it to change out from underneath us. So I can definitely see that really neat story building out there, that you're still saving the time and being friendly to all the people on that DevSecOps team that have to answer that pager on a daily basis.
Yep, absolutely. So
what we're coming a little bit near the end of the segment. I do want to give you a chance to maybe give us another teaser or another preview of as you're peeking over the edge of this trench. What's something else that we might look forward to seeing from your presentation, your panel next week in B-Sides, or something else that you want to leave us with?
Yeah, sure. So we, this is a panel that we've done in, a few different places, few different organizations. I believe this is the first B-Sides that we've done it with. And I really, really enjoyed doing this panel, not because not only because I just like talking about this and sharing my views and talking to others and fielding questions from the audience and all that sort of stuff, but really get to meet a lot of interesting people, folks that had no idea were kind of like having the same problems, working on the same things. We all kind of get stuck in our own little bubble, and we think our problems are unique to us. But it really, as I got out there a lot more and talking to people, I found that they were, everyone's struggling doing the same things, but you don't go to Blackhat Talk to hear necessarily how someone solves patching, right? And so I think this these basics that I complain about, it's some of it's just not, it's not cool, it's not interesting. I tend to disagree in that they, depending on the scale you're working at, or depending on the constraints that you have at your company or in your industry, there's still opportunity to come up with novel ways to fix or mitigate these types of issues, even though like the word patching doesn't really like make anybody jump up and down. But I think like that's kind of part of the fun of security, right? Is coming up with novel ways to fix, what at first glance maybe seem like boring problems or things that might be, beneath your level of interest, and really like, getting on them. So, anyway, to be more specific about your question, so yeah, we're speaking on. This is also why, like, I find that it helps to be surrounded by people who can just kind of like jab you in the arm if you kind of forget what you're talking about. You're rambling on, chilling. You see the audience start falling asleep. It's time to hand over the mic. But
this is why I have co-hosts, exactly.
So So we're speaking Monday the 24th. I believe it starts at 1:30. We've got Clint Gibler from NCC, Zane Lackey from Signal Sciences, Asta Singhal from Netflix, and Justina Osborne from Apple. And like I said, this is some of these folks have been with us at other conferences, or again, if we're at DevSecCon London a few months back. We got some local talent there to kind of like sit in on our panel and talk with us. And so I think it really helps to give the audience like really, diverse, general, idea of like what's happening in information security and application security specifically.
Oh, that's pretty awesome. So yeah, so I'll give a shout out to anybody who's going to be around B-Sides next week to come attend the panel, and of course say hi to Doug and the others that will be there, because Doug, we spoke about Clint's presentation at AppSec Cali, and so I know that he's someone else that he's got some good experience just like yours in these trenches.
Well, Clint's
Absolutely.
coming on in a few weeks, I think, and then we've had Zane on this show multiple times because we love talking to Zane. So, the three of you plus some of the other folks should be a great panel.
A good time.
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. And so, and this was a great session too, Doug. So I want to thank you for joining us.
Absolutely, it's a ton of fun. Thanks for having me.
So I am going to have to apologize now, because I do consider you a friend, and I've always had fun working with you. But Doug is back to the trenches. Sorry.
Well,
go back to the trenches and find some more mistakes that we can learn from. I know I've made several of my own.
We'll do. Maybe next time we can talk about all of yours. We can kind of air some of that dirty laundry.
Sounds fair. Looking forward to that, and checking the schedule in a long way from now, perhaps.
No, it turns out, yeah.
Cool. Thanks again. I want to thank Matt and John, and thank everyone for listening. We're going to take a quick break, and then we're going to return with news of the week.